Take your seats so we can get started. Well, happy Earth Day. Good to see a good turnout for Earth Day. I'm Roger Mark D'Souza, and I direct our programs on global sustainability and resilience here at the Wilson Center. And I'm really pleased to be able to moderate this event today. Today is a very exciting day for us. There are a few things that are going on at the center. This morning, some of you may be aware, we welcomed the president of Honduras and had a very good and interesting dialogue with him. At the same time, while he was speaking, just one floor below, we also welcomed Berta Cáceres, and she's the co-founder of the National Council of Popular and Indigenous Organization of Honduras, and she's the 2015 Goldman Prize winner for Central and South America. So it was excellent because we had the president speaking on the 6th floor, and then on the 5th floor, we had an environmental activist from Honduras addressing issues at the same time. So I thought that was a perfect way to be talking about these issues on Earth Day. A second highlight for me today is the Wilson Center has been involved in an effort together with the G7. We've just released a very exciting report that is being commissioned by the G7. It's called A New Climate for Peace. We've done it in conjunction with a number of partners in Europe, and it specifically looks at 7 compound risks that are looking at climate change, fragility, and conflict. And this is a really good framing of these issues for the G7. It's a report that they have commissioned in preparation for Germany taking over the presidency of the G7. So it's a very good framing on these issues with direct policy implication. So that's my second highlight for Earth Day. And my third highlight is, of course, this panel. What a great way to conclude the day. We're very pleased to jointly convene this panel. It's part of our Managing Our Planet series that we do in conjunction with the Brazil Institute, the Environmental Change and Security Program, and George Mason University. And we're always quite pleased when we do these events with George Mason because we know that there are a number of students who are looking at our live webcast of the event. And that's really quite important for us. So as we think about the issues around global trends, from climate change and population dynamics to food, water, and energy scarcity, we recognize that they really complicate global security, diplomatic efforts, and development policy. And this is a little bit of what we want to talk about today. And I think what you'll hear coming out of the discussion is the need for a more intentional and consistent analysis of the ways in which these mega trends are likely to evolve, interact with one another, and influence the development landscape. So I think it's a very, very exciting discussion here for us today. And I'd like to kick it off by asking Alan Heck, who is the Director of Sustainable Development of the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, to do some framing for us on the issues that we'll be discussing this afternoon as he talks about preparing for years of sustainable development. Alan?
Thank you. I get the slides up there.
Let's see.
Oh, great. Well, thank you all for taking the time to come today on Earth Day. A lot of colleagues here. I'm glad to see you. This is actually, let's see, do I do the slides here, right? Okay. This is an important event that we're discussing today, Earth Day, but I wanted to pay tribute to a colleague up in Colombia, Jeffrey Sachs, who's been working with the UN and doing a lot of work on sustainability. And back in December, Jeff at a meeting said the year 2015 was the year of sustainable development. And it is a critical year in the sense that the UN is debating and hopefully will agree on sustainable development goals. And of course, the climate negotiations will go on, and we hope at the end we'll have international agreement on setting specific targets. But as I pointed out to Jeff and have discussed with many of you and others afterward, not only is 2015 the year of sustainability or sustainable development, but our challenge is years of sustainable development. How do we take actions today? How do we prepare for the future in such a way that we will achieve a more sustainable outcome? You look at the history of climate change, you might say, well, that's not been pretty effective being out front on it. We've argued about it. Now we're really adapting and defending as opposed to anticipating and responding. So the theme today is, what are we need to worry about to move towards years of sustainable development? And what are the driving factors or forces or trends that are forcing us to really think about this as we move forward? So what I've done here is identify some major trends, most of which you're definitely familiar with. I also wanted to highlight that this year, last week, the World Watch Institute launched their 2015 annual report. They do one each year. And the report was Confronting Hidden Threats to Sustainability. And in that, they also looked at some of the major trends in food, population growth, and so on. So it's a very interesting reference if you'd like to get a copy of it. But the ones I identify are particularly important not only to federal agencies, but of course to the business world and all communities. Population growth, urban development, and water and energy needs. And in the few slides that follow, I'm just going to illustrate some of these and then ultimately propose the actions that we need to look at if we're going to actually deal with these issues. Climate change. Obviously, we're deep into that. Extreme weather events, and as you'll see in the slide I have coming up, the projected mega droughts that's going to be really critical for a good portion of the United States. Aging water infrastructure, I'll show you a slide on that. Land use change, going into urbanization or using land for everything from bioenergy to growing more food or to growing less food. Food, water, energy demands, and we'll hear a lot about that. And then in the business world, at least in part, understanding the manufacturing needs, the growth in the business world, and of course, the constraint that may result as we use more and more of our materials. So to highlight some of these, which will be followed up by my colleagues in the discussion, let's take a look at a few of these and ask ourselves as we go through each of these, are we in a position to deal with them in an effective way such that the end result, whether it's in 2030, 2040, or down the road, we can achieve a sustainable outcome? Population growth, of course, is one of the key drivers. We're going to need, this is 2030, we're going to need 50% more energy, 40% more water, and 35% more food. Urban growth is critical, and it led Ban Ki-moon, the Secretary General, back in 2012 to say, our struggle for sustainability will be won or lost in cities. And from an EPA perspective, we are very much committed to helping and working on sustainability at the city, the state, the community, and the tribal levels. And this really reinforces that dramatically. Second, the energy, food, water nexus, a huge topic. In fact, there was a meeting Friday over at the National Geographic Society here in town, sponsored by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, Lockheed Martin, the Conservation International, and a number of others on this theme, looking globally at what it's going to take to meet our demands and how they are interrelated. So this concept of energy, food, water nexus is very important, and Jennifer will give us a nice discussion about that as we move along. Now, I just want to mention that part of projecting trends is, of course, looking at social issues. And we have aging populations. Now, I put my picture up there, but I was actually thinking of several of you to include there. But I didn't want to point the fingers at you. But I think all of us, looking at the audience here, it's nice to see young people. But aging populations also introduces new dimensions about human health care and social issues. So aging population is also something that we want to consider as part of a sustainable future. This is one that I think is really threatening all of us. And while a agency like EPA or other agencies might think of things as sustainable water, each of these things that we're talking about is deeply connected. So when you look at this diagram with the projections, this was put out by NASA, of droughts in the United States, both in Central Plains and the Southwest, you're talking about what they call the worst droughts in 1,000 years. And even now, our colleagues in California are wrestling with serious issues and really have to confront how are they going to deal with it. A lot of these projections were, if you look at that diagram, from 2030, 2040, and 2050 on. But we're seeing a lot of it. And I think when you look about this mega drought, don't just think of it as a water issue, because it's related to agriculture, it's related to ecosystem services, it's related to everything. And that goes very much to the heart of a lot of the things that we're going to be discussing today, namely the nexus of all these and how in our management we're able to bring all the players together. The UN Global Assessment Report on Disaster Reduction from 2015, a big issue, predicts that disasters are expected to cost the global community up to $300 billion in the coming decades. Now, we've seen a lot of this just in the last number of years, even with Hurricane Sandy or Superstorm Sandy and other things that preceded it. $1 billion coming out of FEMA and others to help build the rebuild. We have now the concept of resilience as part of our discussion of sustainability in terms of planning and building infrastructure that will be able to withstand extreme droughts, extreme events. So this is another element of the trends that say, are we out front in order to anticipate and respond to these along with everything else? And I think finally, in the last trend that I'm going to highlight here, or actually one more after this, is a big issue for not only EPA, but cities, urban communities, and the business world, which is the aging infrastructure of what we're dealing with. And a report that came out from American Water Works Association in 2015, which you see here, says investments needed for the buried drinking water infrastructure total more than $1 trillion over the next 25 years. EPA has a new program on this I'll come to in just a minute, and they've estimated the demand about 800 billion, but 800 billion or $1 trillion, it doesn't matter. Think about this over the next decade. The water infrastructure needs that have to be met, the cost of building it, and how we're going to deal with this is another one of the major issues that will determine how we achieve, and if we're able to achieve, years of sustainable development. And finally, in terms of trends, I just wanted to highlight the World Economic Forum's recent report, Global Risks, for 2015. Terry Yossi will talk from the business perspective and talk about risks and so on. They have mentioned many of the same things that we've talked about today, but obviously from a business perspective, the question is, will we have the resources, the energy, the support to carry on and enhance our economic growth over time? Having said all this, then I come back to the core question that we're addressing. How do we achieve years of sustainable development? And I'll give you a perspective which I think reflects a lot of what's going on in terms of federal agencies right now. Some of this I think we're doing a lot. Others I think we could do more. The first is obviously to define the risks and understand long-term trends. It's very important that we really take a perspective that not only says, oh, let me handle this for the next, I got to deal with this next 2 years. You've got to begin to think about the next 10 years, the next 20 years. As we think about this, we have to have in front of us tools, approaches that say, if we go in this direction, what will be the likely outcomes? And in doing that, 1 minute, yes, we will have a number of things. So we talk about decision support tools. In addition to that, we obviously need the system science, the integrated science, the collection of resilient solutions to problems. And most critical, I think, is that no one can do these alone. You need business-government collaboration. And ultimately, to achieve the sustainable outcome, it has to be done in a timely manner. So I have 2 left in my short time here. I just wanted to highlight from the EPA perspective. I could have 100 slides here, but I just wanted to highlight 1 or 2 things that I think reflect what we are trying to do as an agency to be out front. In our strategic plan, we have the goal of working towards a sustainable future. We have extensive programs that deal with community sustainability. We're working extensively on dealing with the drought issues. And if you look down under the resilience side, we're building extensive tools for resilience and now have an MOU with the Rockefeller Foundation to help them in their 100 resilient cities. And we're working right now on a new agreement with the UN called RISE to also do that. And then lastly, a new program announced, Water Infrastructure and Resilient Finance Center, is our efforts to help build those infrastructure needs over the next decades. So in the end, we come to this. The nature of our discussion today, the reason we have such a distinguished audience and guests, and the questions I throw out to you. Does government, business, and the public fully understand future risks and trends? What science and innovation is needed to reduce the risk and prepare for the future? How do we improve public access and use of all of these tools and approaches? Are the federal and state agencies effectively anticipating and responding to them? Are we effective at promoting and building resilient infrastructure? And how do we create effective business, government, public collaboration and innovation? The end result is the challenge ahead. 2015 may be the year of sustainable development, but the decades ahead are years of sustainable development that we need to deal with. And these steps, along with others, are the critical ones to ensure that we will have those years of sustainable development. So with that introduction, thank you very much.
That's a great answer.
Thank you very much, Alan. I sort of like this multi-year perspective, thinking of years of sustainable development, this question of hidden threats and demands and needs and sort of a timely response mechanisms. I do want to push you on one issue, though, that I thought you may have brought out a little bit more. And in talking about the population issue, you say specifically overpopulation, and you talk about these hidden threats and years of sustainable development. And I know that when we work with our partners internationally and they hear this term overpopulation, it does raise concerns because it's a very subjective term. Who is making that determination of what is the carrying capacity there? But more importantly, it raises discussions about a right to development from a developing country perspective. And you talk in your final slide about public access to information, and you made reference to community sustainability measures. So just a little bit more about public participation in this process, and how do you get the voice of the communities from a justice perspective if we're really talking about years of sustainable development?
You've made some good points. First, more people live now in urban communities than ever before. So when we talk about population growth, the stress is on the cities, the communities, and that's one of the reasons why Ban Ki-moon said sustainability is determined in the cities. So that's what I mean when I say overpopulation doesn't mean necessarily that we've overtaken a wetland, but rather I was thinking more of the urban community and how we effectively deal with these issues in an urban environment. That goes to the issue of access, the public access, but also the tools and approaches. In the urban community, whether you're building new apartments or complexes or new roads or whatever you do, it's important to understand what the potential implications are if we move in this direction. We have a variety of tools and approaches that have been developed not only within EPA but across the government. And it basically says, if I go in this direction, this is how much energy I'll be generating, this is how much water I'll be using, et cetera, et cetera. One of our tools that's online that's been very effective is what we call our Enviro Atlas, where you can plug in and ask those questions. It's very important for the decision makers, city, state, communities, to really understand, if I go in this direction, this is what the outcome will be. And therefore help design. If I do more green infrastructure, then this will reduce things the other way. So that's what I mean by public, but at least by decision making. Public information is crucial because we want all communities to understand the pressures on them and to deal with pressures on them. We talk about disadvantaged communities, which are growing now, unfortunately. So it's often referred to environmental justice. We need to be effective in responding to the social needs, not having communities that put excessive pressure on particular community areas. And the public should be well aware of why we're doing things in a certain way. The public actually, and most of us in the federal government, are pressed to think about things over the next year or two. The lessons we have to learn is we have to think beyond that. And that's where this megatrend discussion becomes so important.
Great. Thank you. Well,
Thank you.
Glad to hear those points and sort of public participation and engagement. So I'm really lucky to have a fantastic colleague, Dr. Jennifer Turner, who is the director of our China Environment Forum and who manages and oversees our Global Choke Point initiative. And Jennifer is going to talk a little bit about our Global Choke Point work examining the water energy nexus. Jennifer?
Thanks, Roger. I'm blushing up here. Yep. Thank you. So my megatrend is going to be talking about understanding the risks and finding smart solutions to complex water, energy, food confrontations, which we call choke points, right? So our project here is called Global Choke Point. And about 5 years ago, I went online, and I've got some friends that work at a group called Circle Blue. It's this fabulous news and science NGO in Traverse City, Michigan. Who knew? That they produced just amazing multimedia reports on water. And about 5.5 years ago, they did some reporting on Choke Point US, and they had one question, and really, good reporting is one good question. Their question was, how is energy development impacting water in the United States? And their reporting was way ahead of the Gasland movie, talking about the pipeline from Canada, and they really pulled it all together about how we're facing some trouble in this country. We have a very, it's switching a bit now, the coal shale stuff, but that we have a very water intense country and energy sector. And I thought this was fabulous and said, hey, let's go do this in China. And we did. And we went to China, again, asking the one question, which was, and using my network, talked to government, NGO, business researchers and said, how is energy development impacting water? And the overwhelming response was, 不知道. I don't know. But we will give you data. And so we got data, because people trust me, right? They give us data, and we told stories. And we produced like 25 multimedia reports, graphs, because it's all about good storytelling. The ECSP is the king of good storytelling here at the Wilson Center, and I'm studying their lead here. And so we also went back to China and gave lots of talks, and we have succeeded actually in catalyzing the Chinese government putting water energy confrontations on the agenda. A lot of international NGOs and Chinese think tanks are working on it, and it's bragging, but I must say that the most recent U.S.-China climate and energy agreement included the creation of a U.S.-China water energy program. Whoa. Recognizing a megatrend and acting on it, Alan. This is good, because Secretary of DOE Moniz, he's really into water energy stuff. Now, your first slide, Alan, had Jeffrey Sachs on it, setting the goal, making this the year for sustainability. Well, my first slide is, I think we need to talk about who's on the real front lines when sustainability doesn't happen. It would often be the farmers. And this farmer, this story about our shale gas reporting where Keith Schneider from Circle Blue was out in Sichuan province, and the Sinopec people came out and were asking him, well, why are you looking at our shale gas thing from the road, which was perfectly legal to do. And suddenly this farmer emerged and started yelling at them saying, your shale gas has been killing my fish and my crops are dying. And I said, ooh, microcosm. Water, energy, food confrontations happen at the big and the small scale. Shale gas is not really the main energy source in China. It's really coal. I mean, energy consumption in China has doubled between 2000 and 2007, has doubled again since then, on track to double again by 2020. Still slowing down. That's one of, see, China's the mega trend. The meeting's done after me, okay? China's the mega trend. We finish with them. But actually, so they're using a lot of electricity, and what's that for? Well, Alan mentioned urbanization, and nothing warms the cockles as much as talking about infrastructure. So let's look at 2007, Beijing subway system. Well, the city's growing, and this is now the subway system. It's actually bigger. I need a new map. The world's longest subway system in the world. And on top of that, you have ring road heaven. They are now almost going to complete the 7th ring road, and I predict, mark my words, someday a ring road will go from Beijing to Moscow, right? But to build these ring roads, you need cement, you need steel, and what else do you need, folks? Energy and water, yes. They caught my tagline already here. And since the primary source of electricity in China is coal, here's a nice picture of not China with chicken pox, but actually mapping out where a lot of their large coal bases are. Coal mines, coal-fired power plants, coal to liquids, coal to chemicals, coal to gas. Coal, it is king in China. Now, it's layered on top of it. Maybe you don't see it as well on the screen. This is a waterfall map in China, how much rain falls. Well, red means little rain, people. North China gets only about 20% of the water, but it's where most of the coal is. This is what we discovered. And we went back to the Chinese and said, wow, did you know that, because we tried to calculate how much water the coal sector used, because most times when you think coal in China, you think bad air. But we came back and said, no, actually the air problem is infinitely solvable. It's the water problem. Coal is king and the king is thirsty. And we crunched the numbers and we came up with that of all the water used, 15 to 20% is going just to the coal sector. And no one in China knew that because no one had asked the question. And they said, whoa. And we said, you don't have enough. But we didn't go in there just to tell bad news. We just thought, it's good to know. If you don't know the risks, you cannot address them. And just to give you a sense of the scale, this is a chap coal driver from Inner Mongolia. Inner Mongolia produces 26% of their coal, but only has about 2% of the water. But this is China. We build things in China. Nothing's too big, says the tattoo on all engineers. This is the central line before it was closed up of the South North Water Transfer Project, the world's largest water transfer project. It's moving water. This is the trend here, Alan. Your urbanization, the industrialization, it needs water. And if it's not where it belongs, or where the government, in the case of China, needs it, they will move it. The eastern line's done. I need to update my map. The central line is done. They're talking about the western line. And the big reason they really want to do that western line, which will entail blasting through mountains, is that they want to get coal. They want to get water further in the northwest because that has rich coal reserves in China. Now, reflect a moment. How much energy went into making this? That's one question we didn't get answered. We're wondering, though. But in addition to the embedded cement and steel and pumping, on the eastern line in particular, very dirty water in China. They had to install 400 wastewater treatment plants just to move it. So it's very expensive water at many levels. What about agriculture in China? Water, energy, food, the third component. North central China, where most of the coal is also one of China's grain belts, producing about 40 to 50% of the corn and wheat. And when we were talking, we went back to the Ministry of Water Resources and we showed them our numbers. We said, it's not looking good for water in North China because of coal. And we said, well, what about ag? And I love the Chinese, infinitely pragmatic. They say, 问题不大. It's not a big problem because we are moving the grain belt. Because this is China. You got to make way for the energy. Now, keep in mind, this is not just a story of China. I mean, China, the fastest growing economy, hugely energy intensive, but China is on a continuum of what the rest of the world is doing. When there's a battle in California between the energy and the ag sector, who's going to win? Shout it out there. Of course, the energy sector. You know, we see this all around the world, so China is a great model for us to think about what's going on. And also just, just the general big macro look of how electricity is on the move in China, right? Up in the north, we've got the coal. These are high power transmission lines bringing it to the coast. More coal. Down south here, we didn't talk, hydropower. Coal is king, hydro is queen, shale is coming up as the prince. And so you've got shale and hydro down here, world's fastest construction of hydropower in the world. But a lot of times, because the glaciers are melting, there's not enough water to power it. So yet another choke point. And last, just to kind of gloom and doom here, China is probably the only country in the world I know of that uses the phrase water pollution induced scarcity. Something like 30% of their water is polluted at a level in which the Chinese believe should not come in contact with human beings. And one of the reasons it's not treated, ag is the number one source, but a lot of that ag is for meat production. Urbanization, people getting richer. I'm pointing to you, Alan, because you talked about this, right? And so more meat. You have these urbanization of Chinese pigs, right? These huge factory farms, but they're not always treating the water. So it's not only cities, but it's also the ag sector not taking care of the water burden. And it takes electricity to take care of that stuff. All right, we're going to do a quick dip in India. Because we started a study on choke point India, produced a 13-minute video, which I hope you'll go online and check out. Now India, like China, it's fast-growing economy, big population, urbanizing, not quite as fast as China. And then while they may not admit it, when you look at the trends, they're looking at China as the model. Now in terms of resources, they do appear to be somewhat better off, but they are hitting water, energy, food choke points extremely hard, not because of a lack of resources, but of inefficient use of these resources, bureaucratic politics. And the 2012, there was you guys remember 2012, big blackout in India, something like 600 million people without electricity. Easy to blame infrastructure, right? But it's a bigger story. It's different from China. China, we said, need to make room for coal. The big story was coal-water confrontation. Well, in India, behind a lot of these electricity shortages is actually the overuse of electricity in the agricultural sector, right? Concern for having enough grain to feed this huge population. Water's free, electricity free. And that's meant, here's another farmer, front lines in the choke point here. Not blaming him, but his incentive is to keep the pumps running 24/7. Because it's there and because it's free. And so a growing amount of electricity, and the researchers have said the blackout in 2012 was linked to the continual nonstop pumping for water in the Northwest. Some provinces use as much as 50% of the electricity goes to the ag sector. So, but they've produced lots of grain, but because they produce so much grain, sometimes there's problems with transport, doesn't get to market. But the number to note here is that overall, 19% of the electricity in India goes to the ag sector, to the grain. So they got to get more power. Well, there's rising coal production. And, because India, again, like China, you got to keep the industrialization going, the cities expanding, and you got to keep it for ag. But the challenge has been in India is that while in China, remember my polka dots of all the coal bases where they're opening up coal mines and power plants like crazy fast. But in India, there's a lot of paperwork. There's a lot of difficulty. For example, when Keith Schneider from Circle Blue interviewed some coal mine owners, and they said, we really need to expand these coal mines, but it takes 13 levels up of permits and 13 levels back down of other stamps. And you got to kind of pay people off going up and down. So what India has started to do is that India's become one of the top importers of coal in the world. So their coal use is growing. And while it's still not nearly as much as China, they're on a trajectory to surpass China in terms of CO2 emissions. And what that means in terms of water. So some of the stories we talk about coal-water confrontations in China, we'll start maybe hearing in India. They also, some of their coal mining is done in very inefficient rat hole mining, and this is the theme of our Broken Landscape 13-minute mini doc that I'd love for you to go click on afterwards, not while you're in here. We'll watch you on that. Another challenge with the coal issue is that 1/3 of the power is lost or stolen. There's aging infrastructure there. Go to it, Alan. There's also their desire, to expand hydropower. I mean, back in 2003, the Prime Minister set forth a goal very similar to like the Chinese, like big goals, expanding hydropower, and wanting 162 dams by 2025, and trying to do what China and Pakistan, Nepal, they all are viewing the Himalayan mountain areas as the Saudi Arabia of hydropower. This is the trend. This is the mega trend. If you're looking at dams, this is the mega trend. And so most of the hydropower is up in the Himalayan, in the 5 states here, and a good hunk, like 33 are in I knew I'd messed up. I practiced so much. Uttarakhand. And right there. And this is where we did some pretty kind of shocking reporting about how back in, they've been just lining them up like dominoes in this region. And on June 16th and 17th and 2013, after of an extremely fast coming monsoon, there were just monstrous floods that killed. The estimate, the government said there was like 6,000, but the local government was saying it could have been more like 30,000. The numbers are unclear, but definitely dozens of villages were washed away and lots of roads. And it's actually in there, and there's more facts about other obstacles to the actual construction besides packing them all in the Himalayan region. But in terms of India trying to find a way out of its energy shortage, right? They can't get to enough coal. Renewables are growing, but still not that fast. But hydropower doesn't look as promising. And I think that I have another megatrend for you, Alan. One of the megatrend you insinuated with the natural disasters. I would couch it, here on Earth Day, that Mother Nature is pushing back, and and that kind of pushback that we see to the water, and a lot of the risks and disasters that you were talking about, that you hinted at, some of them are around the water energy confrontations, and sometimes Mother Nature, she pushes back. So, enough fodder for you out there, I hope, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. I love listening to you. And I really like how you pulled together the point about analysis, policy engagement, and reporting, and sort of looking at that at different scales. And I was quite taken to this point that you made about asking the one question. You ask that one question, and the response you get is, I don't know. So where do you go from that?
And then you know you got something.
Then you know you got something. But just to quote some of the things that you say, coal is king in China and the king is thirsty. Coal is king, shale is queen, hydro is coming up as a prince. Water pollution induced scarcity, very, very interesting to sort of recognize this. You and I have spoken about this quite a bit. And sort of moving to India, looking at the overuse of electricity in the ag sector, the point that you make about permitting 13 levels up, 13 levels down, coal, rat hole mining, aging infrastructure, and Mother Nature is pushing back. So the question that I have for you, and I want to go back to something that Alan referred to, where he talked about these hidden threats. And I think in the conversations that you and I have had, you've said to me that these choke point issues have come to the fore now. Is it just Mother Nature pushing back? Oh, no. What's happening now? Why are these being recognized now? Why do we have a U.S.-China water energy program now? What's happening now?
Well, I think that some of it is that they're clearly, there are a lot smart people in the government as well as in the research sector who have started to see that water is really at the core of our choke point work. Looking at how energy impacts water, and that that you see, that where there used to be, there's always kind of the ebb and flow of droughts or dry periods, and then they seem to get a lot worse, right? And that you have situations in countries like with these expanding cities that the electricity, the energy is going to build the cities. But then you kind of get that tussle of like, well, we don't want the electricity to supply the wastewater treatment plants. And then it becomes a problem. So we've seen in countries like China and I believe in India as well, that water quality is dropping and people are getting, people get sick. And so I think that where you have these crises, and we often want to explain them quite simply, the local officials are corrupt. But when I had a room full of Chinese mayors, a couple of years ago, it was like early on in our choke point, I gave them this talk too, and talked more about the U.S. because They like that. And I gave them this talk, and then at the end of it, one said, Dr. Wu, because that's my Chinese name, and he said, Dr. Wu, in my small city, he says, yeah, 9 million. I'm like, okay. I spend about 1/3 of my budget is just for water supply and cleaning it, and I have real difficulties affording that. Is this a choke point? I'm like, that's a choke point. And the whole room of mayors went, oh, because it's funny that not thinking, that also that what has been intrigued a lot of my audiences in China is that how the energy footprint of water, it's definitely growing. And that's the one that we want to, as I said, we're going to dive into and figure out, because China, the case is made even stronger about the cost of coal and the even greater need of conservation, both in the water and the energy sector. And those are all good things. And these are areas where the U.S. and China can cooperate. We are on a level playing field. While we may not be hitting the choke points quite as hard and as grand as we see in China, we still are hitting them. I mean, California, our poster child. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Wu. So Banning Garrett is on the faculty of Singularity University. And Banning, I'm very much looking forward to your talk, because our colleagues have mentioned your issues quite a bit. Urbanization seems to keep coming up. And you're going to be talking about rapid urbanization, exponential technologies, and extreme events.
Well, between everybody covering it and Jennifer being such a hard act to follow, I'm not sure I have anything to say, but I'll try. And thank you very much, Roger Mark. It's really great to be here and with all my friends at the Wilson Center and in Washington. And I sent this to Benjamin, the PowerPoint, which is not any impressive PowerPoint for sure. And the pictures didn't come through, and then they suddenly showed up. That, just so you know, that's a picture of the Marina Bay and billion-dollar complex of hotel with a pool on top in Singapore, and that's a picture I took in Addis Ababa of the town center. So when you talk about urbanization, there's quite a bit different experiences, and we'll get into that. So and what I wanted to do is kind of look long-term, look at these, as you said, the mega trends about urbanization and the scale of it and the challenges that it poses and the dystopia, utopia alternatives that come out of it. And then look at technology, because in Washington, I've spent a lot of time out in Silicon Valley where they do technology out there. Washington doesn't do a whole lot of it, and particularly policymakers tend to know very little about it and sort of exclude it. But I think if we look forward, we better start to factor in the implications of technology, both how it's going to change the world and the opportunities it brings as we look at the urbanization problem. And I just wanted to get across the massiveness of what we're facing. I mean, it's pretty amazing. If you think back to 1800, there were 30 million people in cities globally. I mean, that's smaller than Tokyo today. And you see the trend here. And of course, I'm always a little skeptical about projections, where we're going. And I'll just make a footnote on population, because if you look at the UN projections on population, one of them at the end of the century were at 16 billion, but the other one is 6 billion. So I'd be very skeptical about population projections, particularly when you get out beyond 20, 30 years, because, the short of it is women who have a choice don't tend to want to be baby machines, it turns out. And so that you see when women are empowered, when they move to cities, when there's economic opportunity, birth rates fall dramatically. I think Iran is even 1.7 fertility rate, and 2.1 is reproduction, maintaining an even population. So those population projections, you could well see a peak in the middle of the century perhaps, and then really start to decline. So we have to kind of take some skepticism about it. But just look at the figures here. We're adding, to put it sort of generally, we're adding over the next 35, 40 years, 2 to 3 billion people to cities, 2 to 3 billion people to the global population, and 2 to 3 billion, maybe more, to the global middle class. So when you think about these stresses and strains that have been described already by Alan and by Jennifer, you're really, we've got to think about what all the implications are. So we're going to add 1.5 billion people just to 2030. That's the projection. I mean, think about that. 70 million people a week. I mean a year, 1.5 million people a week. That's a lot of people to accommodate in cities, and building your cities is really the critical thing. I had to steal from Alan's PowerPoint because he sent it ahead. He was very good. The wonderful quote from Ban Ki-moon. But I think this is exactly right. If we get it right in cities, we can solve a lot of big problems. The energy, water, food, all this nexus, climate change, carbon reduction, all that. But if you get it wrong, we're toast, I think is the kind of metaphorical and literal way of looking at it over the next 30, 40, 50 years. So it's really the huge opportunity, shall we say, is the positive way to look at it in cities. And I think that we have to get a sense, just some of the basic things about cities. Cities are where growth is really driven. And this is where everybody's going to be there. When you look at global population increase, virtually all of it will be in cities. So, when we talk about adding 2 or 3 billion people to the population, they're all going to be in cities in net effect. But this is where people gather. This is where innovation takes place. This is where economic growth happens. And you see the amazing statistic from McKinsey that 600 cities generate 50% of global growth, and with 20% of global population. You take any major city in some of these big countries that may have 10% of the population and produce 25, 30, 40% of the GDP of the country. So cities are really critical. This is where the talent goes. This is where the innovation is. Jeff West has argued that you double the size of a city and you double its GDP per capita plus 15%, and you double its resource use minus 15%. So cities can be far more efficient as well as more productive. So, and it's going to be a humongous market. We're talking, I don't know, the figure was thrown out of $90 trillion in infrastructure globally over the next 40 years. Cities could be 50, 60, 70 trillion. So there's a lot of money to be made. There's a lot to be done, but doing it right is what really matters. And there's Pudong in China. There's your massive urban. I started going to China in 1981 before any of this started happening. So, and I went to Pudong, I think in, late 80s or early 90s. And there was nothing there but rice paddies, and because Shanghai wasn't allowed to join the reform really till after 92. And this is all like overnight, by Western standards anyway. So, this is extraordinary. And then this was Christmas at the Pudong shopping mall. They bought in big time to consumerism, and we know where all those resources come from consumers. So sort of put it out kind of, black and white kind of picture. You have a real potential for dystopian urban futures from all the disasters that we've already talked about in terms of pollution and resource depletion and climate change and all that, but the expanding slums. Some people argue that there's about 1 billion people in slums today, could be 2 billion by 2030. We know that slums are where disease, poverty, drugs, gangs, even terrorists are nurtured, so to speak. And then you also have the middle class that has very rising expectations, and government's ability to deliver on those expectations are highly questionable even in the United States and Western Europe, much less in Brazil and other countries that may be even less well endowed than Brazil is. So your potential for real instability is terrifically great, and then you have pretty lousy governance in most parts of the world, and we can't be too proud ourselves, particularly in this town, about how great governance is. So you think how hard it is for us to govern well and manage all these big challenges that our wonderful people in the bureaucracy can see at EPA and HUD and AID and all that, but our inability to actually politically deal with those by making decisions to actually act on with foresight. And you look at our infrastructure needs right now that should be funded but aren't. So think about countries that are very newly emergent as either democracies or maybe not democracies, trying to manage these problems with nowhere near the experience culture of doing so in the past. It's not going to be easy. So you have all these, and of course we have this, we don't know what the impact of climate change is going to be, but we have a pretty good idea that it's going to be a lot of extreme events, weather events, particularly coastal cities inundated with huge storm surges, if not actually flooded by rising sea levels. So this is going to be a big problem. And at last point, I just like to throw out that it's hard to think of a failing state with a successful city, or turn it around. If you want states to succeed, you better work on the cities, make them work, because they're going to drive economic development. They're going to be a source that hopefully spreads outward governance and effectiveness. Now, the other side, of course, is cities can be the real, shall we say, the answer to our problems. That is, we can build great cities, we can bring smart technology, we can have democratic governments. We have the great thing about cities is everybody's there, right? That's a potential big problem, but it's also a way it's much better to deliver health care to people when they're all in this relative same place rather than scattered all over a country. You can do governance, you can do all kinds of things with people gathered in a place where they can actually work together and deal with things. Now, since I'm running out of time here, I just wanted to say that this question of lock-in that I put here in the last, particularly when you think of urban infrastructure, you're locking in infrastructure for a very long time. I mean, cities have long outlived states, right? They've been around for thousands of years. And they'll still be there when the particular state may be long gone. They're going to be there. So you build a city, and you're building for a very long term, certainly decades, maybe centuries or millennia. So you want to get it right. And it really occurred to me that personally, I live in Old Town, just south of Reagan Airport, and we have this coal-fired plant that just shut down in 2012 after 63 years. And I really wanted to figure out, well, people talk about solar and, how it's so expensive and, it's so much better to have, cheaper coal, or that's why it's been advantageous. So I tried to do a calculation on this plant, and there's no data on that actual plant. So I went to the Union of Concerned Scientists and tried to figure out, okay, well, over 63 years, if it's typical of a 500 megawatt plant, it would be about 88 million tons of coal were dug out of Virginia mines and transferred by train to this coal plant and burned. And, 138 billion gallons of water were used, 233 million tons of CO2, and probably somewhere around $4 billion spent for fuel. Now, you contrast that with wind and solar, and nobody's figured out how to put a price on those yet. They're still free. Somebody may figure out how to charge us for it. So I just thought that this is a question of lock-in. You build that plant, they had it there for 63 years operating. Now it's going to be hundreds of millions to tear the damn thing down. So when you're thinking, you got to think long-term. Where are we going with this? And not only where decisions we're taking today might lead us, where would we like to go? And what decisions do we have to make today to get there? And I want to just emphasize that we're at we don't have time to get into this right now, really into technology, but we're in the middle of, really the J curve has taken off on exponential technologies across the board, which are going to change the world far more in the next 20 years than it has been changed by technology in the last 50, maybe 100 years. We're just taking off here as all these technologies are combining and coming together, ICT, materials technology, robotics, and now with bioengineering. It's a very different world that we're facing with huge potential possibilities. But we also have to think, well, what does that mean for a city? I mean, just an example would be, if we're going to have autonomous vehicles in the future, particularly maybe they're not even owned. Everybody just has their little Uber app, and you need a car, you just call it up and it takes you. Suddenly, instead of cars being unused, parked for 95% of their lifetime, they're always in motion. Do we need is, we have something like 60% of our cities are devoted to cars, the space in the city, right? So do we want to keep building Los Angeles on the assumption we're going to have more and more cars, more parking lots, more all this, when maybe actually cities will be where you'll need fewer cars. They won't even need to be parked much because they'll be in motion all the time. So it'd be very different potential down the road. The future is not going to be like the present. My saying is that, things stay the same until they don't, and you can count on it. And I think technology is driving huge changes in where the possibilities are. And one of the pieces of that is the democratization of technology. That is, it's far cheaper and more available to everybody on the planet. I mean, think of your iPhone. This is a supercomputer accessing the cloud with unlimited information from any place in the world that you can use. All the things in this were not even imagined in Star Trek, far beyond anything there. This is just anybody can have them. There are over 2 billion smartphones on the planet today. And then you got 3D printing, where you can become your own designer, producer, marketer, your industrial mogul by yourself. But more importantly, you can make things I call it just-in-time production at the point of consumption. And then you have distributed energy systems with solar, et cetera, and water systems. And Al Watkins back here, he's worked on that a lot. But the point is that maybe we have a very different potential going down the road if you think ahead 20, 30, 40 years. Maybe we should be shooting for more and more production of goods at the point of consumption instead of moving them all over the world. You move STL files like PDFs and then print the thing out where you want it, when you need it. No inventory, no movement of goods, just when you need it, and you can recycle it. That would have a huge change in our global infrastructure and certainly the consumption of energy. But then we have, here's the Made in Space guys that just put up a 3D printer on the space station, and we're printing human organs. There's also printed meat that Andres Forgash is working on at Modern Meadow. But you have the potential to move to more just-in-time production of energy where it's consumed with renewables. You have more just-in-time production of goods where they're consumed. And then you have the possibility, and here's 3D printing of buildings. Very different resource. In a day, this Chinese have built the world's largest 3D printer for houses, 12 meters cubed. And you print a house in a day instead of the kind of construction, and probably less energy, although I have to really check that out. And then vertical farms. You start growing food and producing it where it's consumed. So not that this is so easy or you could do everything this way, but when you're trying to think forward, you're having some foresight. Where are we trying to go? What's a better way of doing things that is feasible with the technology we have now and that we can foresee that would be meet our goals of sustainability, to have a much better chance of dealing with the energy, food, water nexus, and dealing with climate change, both the resilience side, because you're less dependent on this global infrastructure, and just on the reduction of carbon emissions. So urbanization is where it all comes together. If you start dealing with it there, both outward, you start really moving the whole global civilization in a way that has a chance of achieving our sustainability goals. And there's obviously a great difference between Lagos and Karachi versus Copenhagen and Berlin and New York. But all these cities are where the game's going to play out, and where governance is either going to take place or not, and good governance is going to have to involve this kind of sustainability that we've all been talking about. So anyway, there's my take. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Manning. That was fantastic. Wow. Lots of great stuff there. I like that you started by saying that when women have a choice, they don't want to be baby machines. Good to be reminded of that.
Sorry, I don't want to speak for women, but that's my perception from the outside.
That's a good perception.
But I think that the history seems to show
Sure.
that.
A really good reminder looking at Pudong, from rice paddies to skyscrapers in a relatively short period of time. A good reminder on dystopian urban futures looking at slums and this question of lock-in infrastructure. I think what was really compelling for me was your statement, cities have long outlived states. A really good way of framing that issue, I think very compelling. Things stay the same until they don't. Democratization of technology, more just-in-time production, vertical farms, and urbanization is where it all comes together. I think you raised 3 points for me that I think, we had Alan and Jennifer alluding to, but I think you delved into it a little bit more. But you talked a little bit about the middle class. So I was very glad to hear you mention that and include that. I liked that you specifically talked about instability, failing states and failing cities in that perspective, and then a lot of questions on governance, which is very important. So my question for you is on technology, because you talked about it quite a bit. You mentioned smart cities, and you talked about disruptive technologies. For those of us who are trying to look at good models, can you talk about a city that you think is emerging as a smart city in a green context that is doing this well? Maybe some failures, but learning from it that we can be looking to as an example. Where are some success stories that we can learn from?
I don't know what might be considered the best city. There are people who would be able to look at around the world and say which are the best cities. One point I want to make on that issue is that there's an incredible amount of learning that goes on among cities in the world. Thousands of delegations move around. The national governments probably know nothing about. Tim Campbell used to be at the World Bank, runs the Urban Age Institute, wrote a book on this, Beyond Smart Cities. But it's thousands of delegations. So there's effort to learn best practices, new ideas, how to deal with waste management, education, whatever it might be that's on the, that mayors are concerned with. So you're seeing a lot of innovation going on all over the world. I mean, Curitiba was where the bus innovation took place, 20-some years ago, and then starts being copied around the world. So I think that's one of the exciting things, that people are trying to learn from each other. I was just in Berlin in November, and a friend of mine there started something called Intelligent City. And it's actually a big area. There's going to be ultimately 6,000 people working in this block. Florian Leonard. And they have 500 car sharing with 500 electric cars. And they're trying to take that area off the grid as much as possible. And they have companies like Schneider Electric and Siemens are involved. So they're bringing companies together. The Climate Change Institute, the Institute of Technology is in this space in Berlin. So they're trying very hard and they're trying to develop models for how a city can look at all its transportation options from all parts of the city and then vary them with a computer model and figure out considering people's behavior, what's the best system for buses and bikes and obviously subways and cars. So there's so much innovation going on around. I mean, cities are where it's at. I mean, national governments are paralyzed. Look at this one. But look at cities, New York and San Diego and San Francisco and Portland and in Chicago. There's so many cities here that are doing extremely innovative things in different pieces. And big companies like IBM and Siemens and others that are working on the smart cities technology. I was just at a conference across the street this morning on water, and it was all about bringing big data. Kathy was there and spoke at the conference, but it's about bringing big data and the Internet of Things to water management. And a huge improvement in efficiencies and reduction of costs. California can learn a lot from it, and I speak as an exiled Californian who's unfortunately in exile in Washington, and my heart bleeds for California. But in any case, I think I don't think I could point to one city as the best, but certainly Copenhagen, Berlin, and a number of American cities are really trying to push the envelope, but they're learning from each other, and that's I think a really important factor. Or they get Jennifer Turners to come in there and say, "You don't even know what the hell's going on here, do you?"
So it's not ring roads as a solution?
I was there before there were any ring roads in
No, I know.
China. I mean, it's unbelievable. A 7th ring road.
Yeah. Well, no, but it's the idea of the ring roads is like it will solve traffic problems. Where I think
Build
Atlanta
it and they will come, right?
But Atlanta discovered you build it and it brings more.
More good luck. Yeah,
More good
absolutely.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much. So now we're going to go on to Terry Yosey. And Terry is the president and CEO of World Environment Center. And it was great when we talked to Terry about doing this. He said, well, we'd like to be a joint host of this event. So Terry, thank you for being a joint host for us on this. And Terry's going to talk about emerging strategies to manage system level risks. And I am going to pull up your presentation and hand it over to you. Thank you, Terry.
Thank you. Happy Earth Day. I'm delighted to share the podium with so many distinguished friends and colleagues. But after listening to Banning and Alan and Jennifer, I want to make a personal plea to all of you not to slit your wrists immediately after the seminar, because I'm about to offer you some expectations of hope. And my expectations of hope are built around 3 factors. One is, I think there is a broadening conversation and thought process around ideas on how to manage risks from megatrends. And I will offer some examples of that. Secondly, I think we're beginning to see some very concrete evidence that sustainability is beginning to migrate from the periphery more towards the core of missions of some very, very important and influential public and private institutions. And thirdly, we're beginning to see the involvement of decision makers at very senior levels who would typically not participate in discussions of this kind. I'm referring to people like chief financial officers, chief marketing officers, chief procurement officers, and others, not just in the private sector, but in other important institutions. So today, I want to focus on three interrelated topics. One is I want to talk about the changing context of risk. Secondly, I want to give you, and this will take most of my time, I want to lead you through some examples of experiments, of initiatives, which in some cases are beginning to lead to market-level global scale that represent adaptations and other kinds of strategies for managing global scale risks. And then thirdly, I want to conclude with some statements about the implications for public policy. Now, like many of you in this room and watching this seminar, we were prepared in our university training and in the early phases of our careers to think about risk in a very singular fashion. We designed our statutes and our regulations to respond to risks in a very singular fashion. By that I mean we have focused primarily on either individual compounds that presented risks or clusters of compounds like dioxins, or risks from particular industry source categories. And I think what we begin to see emerge over the last decade is that concept of risk, while it will always be with us and we will always need to manage it, has been greatly overtaken by events. I believe this is the context of risk we must teach people about and we must respond to. This is a representation of risk that was published in 2011 by the World Economic Forum. And don't get overlaid by where all the strands of spaghetti connect here, but I do want to make a couple of points about this being the risk context that we ultimately need to not only understand but actively respond to. First is just the sheer magnitude of risks. This chart from the World Economic Forum discusses 5 overlapping categories of risks: economic, geopolitical, environmental, societal, and technological. If you're a global company, if you are a national institution or a global institution, be it an NGO or some other organization of that kind, these clusters of risks increasingly interact with each other, and they have multiplied the need for planning and adaptive and resilient responses for organizations to fulfill their mission. And the second point I want to make about these risks is these risks jump outside of their individual categories. They do a lot of boundary jumping. So if there's a particular risk endpoint that you'll see on the right-hand side called critical information infrastructure breakdown, let's say the water supply system doesn't work correctly, that risk element will jump and get connected to an infectious disease endpoint that you normally don't connect. Similarly, we've seen in this past year extreme swings in commodity prices: oil, natural gas, also many raw materials for smelting. Big swings in those kinds of prices. I believe that economic development increasingly gets connected to factors such as biodiversity loss, because depending on what the prices and the demand of commodities will stress and create political pressures to develop areas that are in sensitive resources for biodiversity. And so I think we're only now beginning to appreciate the interconnectivity of these risks, and only now are we in the formative stages of developing response strategies for them. So I wanted to identify a couple of factors that I think give some indication that our mindset about risks related to megatrends and our methodologies are beginning to evolve or beginning to change. And what I want to do is use 5 different lenses through which to examine these changing mindsets and methodologies. The first is how organizations are responding to expanding risk parameters. Secondly, how it's beginning to impact capital planning and productivity. Thirdly, opportunities for innovation and growth strategies. The evolution and now application of newer financial tools and methods, and then finally, some emerging policy frameworks. So what I'm going to do in the next number of minutes is lead you through some examples where each of those 5 lenses is in evidence in some fashion or another. So the first example I want to use is what's called traceability. Traceability is a system for tracking and tracing the moving tracking and tracing the movement of ingredients across a chain of commercial activities. The example that's on the slide here is an application of a traceability system for beef production and consumption. And this system is increasingly in place by not only the agricultural sector, but also the retail sector, because consumers are increasingly fed up with E. coli bacteria in their spinach salad or in other kinds of food contamination. Traceability systems enable companies and ultimately consumers to be able to know how the cattle are raised, what they're fed, how the food is grown and prepared, what the conditions are in the feedlot, how beef is processed, and ultimately the quality and the condition of beef that ends up in your restaurant or on your table at home. The reason these systems are starting to find growing popularity is because the price of information technology continues to decline, and secondly, there are clear benefits to applying traceability systems. Just one quick example. It used to be the case that when there was an E. coli contamination of spinach that may have originated in the Central Valley of California, regulatory authorities didn't know the exact origin of the contamination, and so they had to institute a massive recall of spinach products. Now, through traceability systems, it's much more evident that you can target where that contamination originally occurred, thus avoiding disruption to business and commerce, thus reassuring consumers more quickly. And we're beginning to see the application of these traceability systems in a broader array of commerce. A couple of weeks ago, the Obama administration announced that through the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, that every single fish imported into the ports of the U.S. would be able to be tracked and traced for the purpose of preventing illegal fishing and also protecting against overharvesting. So it'll take a couple of years to get that up and running, but I think that's an indication that the federal government is fully committed to traceability, as is the Food and Drug Administration through the passage of the 2010 Food Safety Modernization Act. We're beginning to see it applied in the pharmaceutical industry to protect intellectual property, the chemical industry to prevent the diversion of chemicals into weapons of mass destruction, and the electronics industry as well. Next example. Consumers are a part of this equation, and Banning was just talking a few moments ago about the power of our mobile devices. Well, that can be applied increasingly in commercial terms, because it's very easy these days for a variety of consumer products to know if the product I'm buying contains some prohibited substance, or to know whether it's on a recall list, or know whether some retailer's claim of organic can in fact be held up subject to scrutiny. This data is eminently downloadable on our mobile devices, as is in deciding whether to purchase a new car. We want to find out whether the materials that were used in the making of that auto were based on conflict minerals or based on labor in a developing nation where labor wages or conditions were substandard. So I think the consumer is increasingly playing a role in not only traceabilities, but also in terms of the reputation of companies. And companies that fail the test, they're going to fail it fairly quickly, and they'll pay a very severe consequence in their marketplace. Another example is value chain analysis. If you look in any major business textbook by the mid-90s, you would have never encountered this term. This is a fairly recent concept that only began to appear in published business school articles such as the Harvard Business Review and other journals beginning in the late 90s. Michael Porter, many other scholars began talking about it. What it refers to is the entire chain of production and consumption that is involved in making goods and services. And so what I've shown here on the slide is an example of a natural gas value chain. This is connected to some new emerging public policy frameworks for how we ought to think about methane releases, carbon capture and regulation, and a variety of other endpoints. So there's a great deal of concern, a great deal of interest in the development of the natural gas industry in this country. A lot of concern about methane releases. But if you are only focused on what happens at the production well where the fracking occurs, you're going to miss a great deal of the story here and a great deal of the impact. Only through a broader value chain analysis where we begin to look at the movement of natural gas from the point of production all the way through the pipelines and ultimately through the end users, be that a large utility selling to a commercial customer or an individual household. Only by understanding that chain of relationships can we make more intelligent regulatory policy decisions about where are the greatest sources of risk, what are the particular policies for abating that risk in the most cost-effective way possible. I think a value chain approach begins to give you those insights. Every industry has a value chain, from textiles to toys to aluminum to automobiles. And I think a more powerful tool is emerging to analyze environmental impacts, and the beauty is that that tool is very similar to how businesses actually organize their day-to-day operations. So we're starting to see a convergence of how an analytical tool really gets connected to the DNA of how organizations like global companies can actually operate. And we've seen some prominent examples of that already from Walmart and Unilever, Procter & Gamble, Nestle, but also the pressures they're putting on their chemical customers to reformulate chemical products in favor of green chemistry. Now, not all of this is happening at the macro global level or through global companies. We're seeing more and more examples of individual communities starting to develop new kinds of risk assessment methods to deal with the impacts of global megatrends. Because after all, the impacts of all global megatrends are bound to be expressed locally in one form or another. So I want to give you an example of how emerging kinds of analysis is actually affecting capital planning at the local level. If those of you familiar with the San Francisco Bay Area know about the Bay Area Rapid Transit System. It's their metro. And like our metro, their metro suffers from an aging infrastructure, but in the case of San Francisco Bay, more immediately, there is the concern of sea level rise. And many parts of the BART system are very close to the bay. And so the mayor and other executives in Oakland have commissioned some newer kinds of risk assessments that enable city decision makers to better understand what the vulnerability of the BART system is to sea level rise and storm surges and things like that. And so they develop a different kind of risk assessment methodology, not focused on toxicology, epidemiology, and animal extrapolation, but rather focused on operational safety and the infrastructure's integrity. But I think a truly unique part of this approach is they have taken these kinds of analyses and coupled that to the capital planning process. So the people in the Public Works Department and in the mayor's office in places like Oakland are now looking at these kinds of analyses as a way to make resource allocations. And so what that does, potentially, is to enhance the intelligence of the entire decision-making process. Whether it will get applied in all instances, probably not. But at least we begin to optimize the decision-making system to allow decision makers to make more intelligent choices if they choose to do so. I want to give you another local example, and I mean very local. It's another example of where a global megatrend has a local impact. 2 years ago, a major hospital in Fairfax County was experiencing a rise in the heat index. The heat index topped 105 degrees in Fairfax County one afternoon. What people in the hospital didn't realize, or in government in general in Fairfax County, was when the heat index begins to exceed temperatures like that, it really starts to compromise the air conditioning systems of hospitals. The consequences of that are very dire and very immediate. Surgeries have to be rescheduled or postponed. People who are in the intensive care unit may have to be relocated. And other functions from rehab and other patient care activities have to be rethought on a very short-term basis. And this was not a scenario that a major hospital in Fairfax County had ever thought about. It's probably not a scenario that virtually any hospital has had to think about in its history. In this case, there was a short-term commercial solution in that a company called Ingersoll Rand has a SWAT team that is able to revive and restore the integrity of air conditioning in buildings that are heat stressed within a 24 to 48 hour period. But I think going forward, what this tells us is even the functioning of a local hospital is no longer immune from a global megatrend. And so it's not just a hospital. It could be the library. It could be the public school. It could be the university. It could be the government buildings. It could be any institution whose buildings increasingly are stressed out by rising heat indexes, which is something we all expect will happen with greater intensity and frequency. I want to give you one other example that you might not expect, given the company that I'm talking about, the Walt Disney Company. Happy times in Orlando and in Southern California and Shanghai and outside of Paris and places like that. That is Disney's reputation as a family-oriented business. It is very sensitive to anything that would compromise that reputation, given how it makes its money and does its work. A couple of years ago, Disney did a carbon footprint analysis of the major sources of carbon across its businesses. And of course, they've got theme parks, they've got TV and movie studios, they've got 2 cruise ships at that time, whose carbon footprint was equal to the rest of the entire company. Wow. And so the company went through a lot of discussion about what to do about this. You could go through training of your employees, you could put together long-term plans, and it was actually the chief financial officer who carried an incredibly influential voice within Disney. His response was, let's impose an internal carbon tax on all of our businesses across the entire company. That will incentivize our employees to behave differently, to think differently, to innovate responses so that we can bring this carbon footprint down before we are challenged publicly in a way that lessens the value of our corporate reputation. And that's what Disney did. And so over time, these numbers have come down. The carbon tax is, the internal carbon tax is imposed in such a way that managers who fail to achieve certain outcomes find their bonuses are reduced. So there's some very strong tangibility to all this in ways that's eminently measurable. Another example of innovation that gives me some expectation of hope is the increasing focus on valuing natural capital. What you see on the slide is the result of an effort between the Nature Conservancy, the Corporate Eco Forum, and about 20 companies a couple of years ago to at least make the business case for why this is an important topic. It's an important topic for pollution control and prevention. It's an important topic for protecting biodiversity. It's important for wetlands, for water purification, as well as watershed management. I think the good news here is that this topic has begun to migrate. Instead of just being a nice analytical tool or an academic exercise, I happened to be participating in a webinar last week with a CEO of Dow Chemical, who last week announced Dow's 2025 sustainability goals. There are 7 of them. One of them deals with valuing natural capital. And the commitment is that by 2025, Dow is going to generate $1 billion in cost savings or new cash flow as a result of investing in natural capital, innovations and investments. I think that's where you begin to see concrete application of an issue that uses the incentives that a company like Dow has to think about on a day-to-day basis in integrating that with its business going forward. And then one of my favorite examples about thinking through how existing organizations have to rethink their operations is my old workplace, the Environmental Protection Agency, where a committee of the National Academy issued a report last September that was basically a roadmap for EPA to become more sustainable. Alan presented some slides at the beginning of his presentation that I think did a very nice job of summarizing directionally where EPA is going. I think the Academy Committee gave important reinforcement to that, but talked about an even broader set of roadmaps, not just in the strategic plan, but program by program across the agency. So let me conclude by saying that all of these developments are going to have major implications for public policy. I think we're going to have to increasingly think about policy embodying a systems approach rather than just a pollution control approach or a pollution prevention approach. I think we're going to have to look for new kinds of ways to begin to develop more integrated tool sets. We're doing risk assessment in one part of our organization. We're doing life cycle assessment here. There's a strong case increasingly to marry those up. The integration is a much more powerful tool. Thirdly, we need to start thinking about regulating entire value chains and not just specific source categories. I published an article earlier this year in the Environmental Law Institute's magazine making the case that EPA's proposed climate rules is a very good example of regulation across the value chain based on policy precedents and legal cases that I reviewed looking at the history of EPA over the last 25 years. I think there's a strong case that what EPA is doing here is not just regulating carbon from utilities, it's really thinking across the value chain, and that ought to be encouraged. Governments are having a hard time thinking about participating at the global market scale level, but we have examples from NGO collaboration with companies on how to do that. And finally, there's a lot of new skills and competencies that have to be developed to make all this happen. That conversation has started along with this entire conversation that I'm describing. So I think that we all have a role to play here as consumers, as analysts, as decision makers. We are still not moving forward at a pace that is catching up with the impacts of global megatrends, but at least I'm not going to slit my wrists after today's seminar. I'm going to harness my expectations of hope and hope to do better. So thank you for your time and your interest.
Thank you very much, Terry, for giving us a reason not to slit our wrists. I think what I particularly liked about that presentation was when you got to talking about EPA. I don't know if you saw the smile on Alan's face.
Of course I
did. No, that was great. Thank you very much. I particularly enjoyed how you framed the question around risk profiles and very quickly took that to specific examples around traceability, empowerment, value chain analysis, linking analysis to capital planning processes, very informative. I liked your phrase, enhance the intelligence of decision-making processes. I found that very powerful. The example of even a local hospital is not immune from mega trends. I thought that was a very powerful example. And I really like this innovative approach of the chief financial officer making a difference in Disney and thinking about an internal carbon tax before we're challenged publicly. It strikes me as you talk about these issues, you talk about compound risk, you talk about a systems approach, you talk about anticipatory planning system and tools and financial ways of addressing those. And it seems that reflects quite closely what we talk about in the resilience community. This is part of what we talk about in resiliency thinking as a programmatic approach. And as we know, this is comes in some part from the business sector. The one thing I'd like to hear a little bit more about, Terry, is I think you spoke a lot about business operations within the United States. And I'd love to hear some of your thoughts in terms of how these corporations are looking at their operations overseas, particularly in developing countries or even in countries like China and India. How is that translated to their overseas operations?
I actually believe that some of the direct impacts of global megatrends are manifest at a more rapid pace in developing and emerging markets before you might even see them in Western Europe or North America. And for at least most global companies, I think that their traditional model of learning and application of knowledge would have started in the West and then been applied in an emerging country. I think there's now a reverse flow of that in which whether it's best practices, business models, social innovation, I think more of that has gained momentum as a result of what's happening in developing countries. And we in the West are on the side of learning. And I think people in the North or in the South and in the East Asia Pacific area and other regions are the laboratories for this. So that would be point number one. Secondly, I think that there used to be this very strong boundary zone that people like Milton Friedman misguidedly taught us, that the purpose of a company was to make money and to enhance shareholder value. Well, you're not going to find that notion anywhere in any corporate charter. The purpose of a company is to make products and services that attract customers, and in the process, expand that value not only with shareholders, but with communities and workers and others. And I think there is beginning to take hold a view that a growing number of business leaders are adopting, that we need to get away from short-term thinking about the next quarterly report. We need to increasingly separate this boundary between business and society, because some of the most important innovations that are happening, and again, I think they're happening first in developing countries, is around various kinds of social innovation. You're not going to solve the water efficiency or the water challenge or the carbon challenge without connecting it to a social development model at the same time. And this is not naturally occurring territory for many companies. They tend to prefer in their DNA just to think about making more widgets. But I think that if you're Coca-Cola and you've experienced the wrath of people in India because they think that you're taking water from their community to make your product, you're going to be learning to adapt to that and learning to behave. And I think the Unilevers and the Nestles and the IBMs and many other, not just American companies, but companies from all over the world are expanding their investments in that kind of idea. Just one quick example that I'll give you. Many of you may have been following, and Banning, you referenced IBM in one of your comments. IBM has an artificial intelligence system called Watson. Well, they're now seeing Africa as a huge market opportunity for the company, and they made a 10-year, $100 million commitment to apply the Watson artificial intelligence system in countries like Kenya, Uganda, and other areas for purposes of healthcare management, for purposes of transportation and congestion mitigation, for purposes of sanitation and water quality analysis. And so, what is IBM's motivation on this? It's economic, it's financial, using social outcomes as a driver for them. So to me, that's a different kind of business model, a different kind of developmental model than we typically have seen, and very much distant from what's still taught in business schools.
Excellent. Thank you very much. That was fantastic. So I want to open it up for discussion, but Benjamin, if I can ask you to come to the front, I actually want to start by asking a question of my colleague Dan Scleroux from George Mason University. So Dan, you've heard this panel and this discussion about megatrends and its sort of implications for sustainability from a variety of sectors. You are with a university and you have your students tuning in to these issues that we are discussing. What are you hearing from your students? To what degree, as we think about workforce development for our young people coming out with a tertiary degree, are young people thinking about this now? What are some of the thoughts and reactions from your students and the university community on these issues? Can you talk a little bit about it? Mm-hmm. Oh, is Dan here from George Mason? Anyone from? All right. Well, go ahead. Yes.
Oh, need a mic.
So I'm not Dan.
Yeah.
I'm Claudio Cioffi from George Mason University.
There you go.
Vice President for Research.
Great.
I think our students are very concerned about this, and one of the ways in which we try to take advantage of these rich questions is to unify, to some degree, teaching and research, because there are very few viable answers known to these complex problems today. And in teaching about them and in teaching about the challenges of this urbanized world, this is something that students are deeply interested in. Also in terms of the social media and the other technological parts of their life. This is part of the solution. These are not the obstacles. So there are some experimental programs in terms of bringing into the classroom research ideas that may enlighten the future as we transition to this hyper-urbanized civilization of just a few decades away.
So you're hearing a demand from the students to learn more.
Certainly.
Great.
For example, this summer we're running in Europe, as a matter of fact, a summer school on smart cities and computational social science, which will be in the island of Lipari in the month of July.
Excellent. Okay, so let's open it up. If I can ask you to give your name and your affiliation and go to your question.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for your comments. My name is Matthew Jalisik. I'm also a professor at the University of Colorado in Boulder. And I'm spending this year as a Franklin Fellow at USAID, and I've been recently appointed as a Global Fellow at the Wilson Center. I helped found a living learning community. A group of 500 freshmen live in a dorm and are engaged in a program called Sustainability and Social Innovation. We just won a national award from Ashoka for this work. And I would say that while the aspirations of the students are to solve global problems, they enter university as freshmen with a very limited understanding of problems of dealing with complexity. They would like the answers to be very simple. And so the work I'm going to be doing at the Wilson Center is to try to figure out how we can explain complexity in a more comfortable way, a less daunting way. But I think that for the community, it's not quite at the wrist-slitting level, but I think the community really needs to grapple with ways of not oversimplifying things, because it makes the non-experts feel as though the answers must be simple, and they're not. I have a question. On the relationship between the developing communities and in the world and urbanization, it seems to me that we have a kind of set of models that are based on a technological response. And I think that that is going to be difficult to attain in the near future, and yet the cities are going to grow extensively. I'm wondering if people on the panel could start to talk perhaps about non-technological responses to the dramatic increase in urbanization that we're seeing in countries that have extremely limited resources. Thank you.
Great. Let's take we had another question. Yes.
Yes, thank you. First, thanks to the organizers for putting together this tremendous event this afternoon. It's been very stimulating and thought-provoking. I'm Jerry Miller. I'm the director of the Science and Technology for Sustainability program at the National Academy of Sciences. And in the interest of full disclosure, Alan serves on my sustainability roundtable. So I'll direct my question to the other panel. I'll be able
heard
to
enough from you.
beat up on Alan later on. I'd like to hear about the social infrastructure part of this equation. And Terry began to touch on this a bit in his final comment. To move communities and states and nations in sustainable directions, it seems to me that we need to pay some attention to the web of activity in communities, the networks on local levels, because after all, everyone whom we would like to respond in a positive way lives someplace, they work someplace, they live in communities. So the social infrastructure aspects from the perspectives of the other three panelists, other than Alan, I would like to hear.
Great, thank you. Thank you. Does anyone have a question for Jennifer? Because Jennifer needs to step out a little bit earlier for familial obligations.
See, families have their own megatrends.
Yeah. So let's take those two questions, and then we get some more. But Jennifer, let's start with you. If you want to engage on social infrastructure to move communities and sort of non-technical responses for countries with limited resources. Any thoughts?
Well, yeah. Well, I think that I can talk more about the non-technical. I mean, looking at China in terms of their urbanization, because their urbanization is driving a lot of the resource consumption, and that they. But there is a realization, I think, and what's exciting to see is that one of you mentioned, I think you mentioned about how cities are starting to talk to each other, and that we're starting to see more Chinese cities are getting involved in some of the international organizations like C40. I mean, the Chinese government, like, you know, the problem, Beijing, the mayor just said, my city's unlivable, right? You can't, it's like, isn't that
It's
lovely?
moving out.
He's like, yeah, well, but he said, and so the solution is that we're just going to start, you know, even though the central government policy is to urbanize, I mean, they're going to start pushing people back out. And so there's on one hand, you have some cities like Beijing, where like we're moving them out again. And then you have other cities in southern China, you know, again, these medium-sized cities, which are also giant, they're like New York's, right? But that's small for China. And you have, it started off as a central government policy, but you have some cities starting to form clusters. So again, like 3 New Yorks coming together, and they're starting to think about, you know, at the local level, you know, forget about what's happening upstairs. How are we going to create transportation that makes sense? You know, that, you know, how can we, you know, economies of scale in terms of maybe industrial parks that if we pool our resources, they can start doing waste to energy solutions. That's a big gap in China. You could save lots of energy and water if you had, you know, wastewater treatment fed into energy solutions, right? But what's really exciting is I'm seeing some of this happening at the bottom, which is why, you know, we have a project I'm going back to China in the summer to start working in Shenzhen, looking at choke point cities, right? Looking about what is Shenzhen doing? This is the city right across from Hong Kong, and the mayor, I met him. He's like, we're working on being innovative and clean, and I'm like, okay. And so we're going to try to find out, you know, what is the energy water footprint of Shenzhen and what does it mean for pollution? And so I think that it's exciting to see in China that there are some, you know, creative innovations happening. But yeah, I'll have to kind of leave the other question to the other panelists.
Okay, thank you. Terry?
I think that there are in existence already a number of both large and sophisticated social networks that those of us who live in Washington or the West don't know a damn thing about. But these networks are already very sophisticated and they're working at scale. So I'll just give you a couple of examples. I was intrigued when Apple introduced its latest phone, where you could begin to do your banking, and you have the capability increasingly to transfer funds and manage things like that. Well, they've been doing this in Kenya for the better part of a decade through mobile money. Now, there are specific social circumstances that motivated people in Kenya to think and behave this way. One is there was not already some kind of sophisticated infrastructure for landlines, and so you technologically have to leapfrog into mobile technology. So the mobile technology already existed. In Kenya, you had a Safari.com network that got connected to the banking system, and so many Kenyans on a monthly basis can pay their bills, can order products, can do a variety of things that we in the West haven't even begun to think about, much less develop the networks around. In India, you have a number of small businesses run by women who manage these kiosks where they're selling pharmaceutical products, food products, shampoos and soaps, and a variety of other things. They're able to download information about what's the latest market price for selling grain and a variety of other applications. And then you begin to see companies like Ford, which is conducting projects in India and Brazil to provide mobility to women so that they then have an electronically driven office, otherwise known as a car, from which to conduct commercial activities. And Ford is going to conduct these demonstration programs in India and China, Brazil, and Indonesia much sooner than they will in America and Western Europe. Part of the reason is because I think they find that people in those countries are much more open to this kind of experimentation. Whereas when you talk to regulatory agencies in the U.S. and say that you've built a car that won't emit any pollution, or at least not nitrogen oxides and particulates, sometimes the response is, well, then how are we going to regulate you? I don't think that's a productive conversation. So my point is, and it was reinforcing some of the things I was saying in my talk, is that I think a lot of the learning and the application of knowledge is already underway. It's just what we need to figure out is how to scale it and how to mobilize it and move it at a much quicker pace to offset the pessimism that I heard earlier this afternoon.
I am not pessimistic.
Yes, right.
In response to Terry's comment about pessimism, I like to say that the global civilization is sort of heading for the cliff, but it's not going to go over the cliff because nobody saw the cliff. There are a lot of experts out saying, hey, you got to change course. It doesn't work to go this way. You got to go over here. So I think the jury's out on whether we will change course, but the alternatives are certainly out there. I'd like to go back to the two questions and the non-technical response and the social networks, and I think in some ways they're related. I think that I'm not sure what's meant by non-technological responses, because I think we're embedded in technology. This iPhone is maybe for us older people, it's not quite the extension of our body that it is for others, but basically we are embedded in this technology. It's part of us. But it's also highly democratized. That is, everybody has access to this. Mm-hmm. But what we're doing, you don't have one, right?
Pakistan, Karachi, 0.4% of the people have internet access.
0.4.
Yeah, I mean, there's some cities that, on the other hand, in India, I think there's twice as many cell phones as there are toilets. People with cell phones that don't have toilets. So, I mean, it's very uneven. You're right. And if Mark Zuckerberg gets his way with internet.org, we'll wire up the entire world. The last mobile device with the internet access will be handed to some person in Karachi in 2022. I mean, we're headed that way, let's hope, because there's a huge democratization of opportunity when people have access to whether it's mobile money, whether it's the cloud, whatever it is. But I think that a lot of these technologies now it's not high tech. They're very, very high tech in a way, but on the other hand, everybody can use one of the things. There are probably 99.999% of the people who use these really don't know how they work. How they actually, going down to the quantum level of the microchips, all the way to the GPS system, how it all works. But they know how to use them. Yeah, I mean, I don't know how it all. I can't explain the quantum effects of quantum tunneling and stuff.
In China that when they had their first the big air apocalypses that started in the winter of 2012, that there was an environmental NGO that there are apps where you can actually measure. Mm-hmm. There are phones that you can measure the air quality and upload it. And then I'll laugh about how your reading is so different from the government's reading. But the idea that that citizen science through your iPhone. And that idea, that's kind of the social network you were probably talking about.
Yeah, I was going to just add. Thank you, John. Sorry.
Thanks, John.
With 3D printing, for example, I mean, one of the things I've wanted to see was particularly like AID or some big companies to support development of tech shops all over the world. 3D printers for kids in Nairobi. I've been in Nairobi. I've seen the energy there. And if you turn these kids loose, it doesn't take that much training to learn how to use a computer for design, send the design to a 3D printer, and print out a product. And you could start generating kind of a bottom-up transformation of these economies. It uses high-tech, low-tech. I mean, these are low-tech in the sense that anybody can use them. They're high-tech that has led us to be able to make these things by the billions. Or 3D printers now are, well under $1,000. So you could allow these networks of people, going back to the social networking thing, communities to have access. Al Watkins has worked with people on solar-powered water purification system that might cost $75,000 and 4,000 people could get clean water per day. You could start putting those into favelas, much less rural areas. People build a business around it. They charge a penny a liter for water. They have a vested interest in maintaining that system, make it work. They have a little business. They're starting to actually create jobs and do a bottom-up transformation of the economy. They're using high-tech, low-tech, I would call it. I mean, it's accessible tech that a person or a small group. And then what's beautiful about this is you can scale it, take the small scale and scale it up. Think about building a big water treatment plant and all the pipes connecting all the people in, Rio or something, particularly in the favelas. How long is that going to take? And it's all top down. I don't know, it's $1 billion from the World Bank, it takes 10 years to build, and of course the water's going to first go to the rich people, et cetera, et cetera. So you're not dealing with the problem right away, but you might be able to start buying these cheap water purification systems and just scale them up as people build little businesses overnight. In a matter of months, you're transforming the people's lives with those kind of systems, and you're building networks around. You're building them with networks. You build them with the people in these areas rather than a top-down imposed solution. And with 3D printing, you can start building little businesses to import substitution from all the crap coming from China. You make it on demand for the people in the community. You're employing kids, you're getting them off the street, you're building little businesses, you're building on the networks that exist, and you're of course going to those people to give them tools to build what they want rather than some big solution that's imposed from the outside. So technology can actually work in a little different way than we think of some huge technological solution that swoops in on the wings of IBM and transforms the world while everybody stands and watches. So it could feed the building of communities rather than destroy it or simply be imposed on it. I guess that's my feeling why we have an opportunity to do something that was not possible in the past. This democratization of technology, call it what you will, is a phenomenon of the last 5-10 years. Couldn't be done 20 years ago. So we have new opportunities to think differently about how we go about solving these problems.
I think we have a couple more questions we want to get before we wrap up. Yes, please. Go ahead.
Okay. My name's Dan Martin. I'm a former foundation officer now working with the Climate Reality Project. And I heard a lot of reference to experts. The word expert turned up in probably everybody's comments. And Terry said at one point that the business model that seems to serve resilience is not being taught in business schools. So this takes me to the question as to how we're going to develop resilience when our higher education system works against systems thinking in favor of expertise. So the people who are at one end of a chain in that World Economic Forum map with all those relationships will be experts in one piece of it or another, but not on the interactions because they were trained to be experts. So I really hope that there are some I know there are very specific programs in some places like Earth System Science emerging at MIT and a few things like that. But that's exceptional. And you know how a professor gets tenure and gets ahead by being hyper-specialized. So there's an old saw that I think is sad but true and works against the optimistic outcome of the issues that you've been describing, which goes like this. The world has problems, but the university has departments.
Yes, well put.
What's the prospect of preparing young people to take systems views?
Great, thank you, Dan. I think we had, is there another? Yes, quickly. And if you can get to the question very quickly, please.
Thank you. I'm Bob Winterbottom. I work at the World Resources Institute. And my question is, if we could maybe thank you all for bringing out all these megatrends. And I'm wondering, with respect to the sort of the technology issues that are out there, how they might feed into our efforts for more sustainable intensification in agriculture, precision agriculture, those sorts of things, in dealing with the food energy nexus. And similarly, on the transportation side, more sustainable transportation systems that could, instead of just another ring road. And then finally, if there isn't maybe a mega trend out there that relates to just sort of us finally sort of taking stock and saying we've degraded a lot of ecosystems, we've undermined a lot of natural capital, it's time now to invest in restoration and restoring and rehabilitating and providing some economic incentives for that. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And very, very quickly, please.
Yes, my name is Iris Goodman. I work at EPA. This is a very simple and direct question. Love the notion that there are these, especially from you, Terry, about these trends where corporations are acting in a responsible way. And I'm wondering if any of you can just offer a very quick perspective on what trends are fostering that, what megatrends are fostering that sort of course for corporations, and then also what factors, what forces, what trends still remain that may make it harder for corporations to achieve that.
Great, thank you. So, Terry, I'm going to ask you to respond and sort of conclude. So, experts versus expertise in universities, intensification of agriculture, sustainable transportation systems, restoration, trends fostering innovation of corporations.
You have
and
30
challenges.
seconds.
30 seconds.
Elevator speech.
All right.
I really like the question dealing with experts in universities. We're always going to need experts. We need to have people who have technical competencies and command of content. That's, to me, that's a given. That's the foundation around which we need to establish and sustain to go forward. However, as I look at not only governments, private companies, non-governmental organizations, particularly those that are working increasingly outside of their native country, there's a different set of skills that are also required. People who have an understanding of different cultures, people who know how to work in teams of people, some of whom are located in the West, some of whom are located in a developing country. People who know how to synthesize information from risk assessment and life cycle analysis and integrate that into a financial model. Those sets of integrated skills, my conclusion is, are largely not being taught at most business schools. And I think the business schools are paying a price for that, because you look at MBA enrollments in this country, they're in decline. I think the students are already ahead of the curve in voting with their feet. And if you look at who's an active force for lobbying for changes in the core curriculum, it's the students. After the 2008 financial crisis, many of the students at the Harvard Business School blamed their own faculty for teaching the people on Wall Street how to manage our finances. So I'm encouraged that students themselves are increasingly aware and mobilize in this fashion. I also think an increasing factor that's going to come into play is global companies are in a competition for talent. And I think they're going to be thinking more strategically of how that talent is developed and how they access it. And I think whereas their traditional relationship with universities has been around philanthropy and things of that nature, I think the incentives are being laid for companies and universities to collaborate much more directly. And we're certainly involved in that activity very directly. So I think there are some structural barriers, including the departmental mindset that you referenced. But I see a lot of new conversations getting started there, too. In terms of the EPA question, former EPA question, I think access to markets is a big driver here. And I think companies are following their natural habits of wanting to make products that are viable in the marketplace. Only the same business model, the same products you sell in the West can't be sold in the same way in other countries. And so companies are having to adapt to that and to take social factors and others into consideration. But let me stop there.
Great, thank you. Hello?
I'll just make one or two comments since we're running to the end. I think on the academic side, yes, the tradition is to stick to your departments, but I think a broader role for the academic community is to educate people as to what are the problems that we are facing in the world today. And then you can apply the science, the technology, the innovation as part of the solution. And I think history is very important here. We're no longer dealing in a world in which we're dealing with single source pollution problems. And I think the more people understand the complexity of the problem, the more you see the need for the systems thinking and integrated approaches to it. So I think that's an important role for academics. I think the other lesson or discussion that's important here is that in no way can these problems be addressed only by government or business. The collaboration and partnerships are absolutely essential. And in fact, the business world has been out front on sustainability more than the governments have. And I think that reflects the pressures on them, the social marketing skills, as well as the ability to achieve their results, given stress on costs of energy or water or so on. The next generation of solutions must be technology-driven, business-government collaboration, and much more system thinking, both domestically and internationally. And I think that's an important message out of the academics, an important message out of the business world, and even a more important message that comes out of government.
Thank you.
I have a personal model that I don't necessarily recommend for everybody, but some people know more than they understand, and other people understand more than they know. And I like to be in the second group. We need our experts, but we also know people that you don't have to be a climate scientist to know that we got a climate change problem. And it's an integrated problem. It's economic, it's environment, it's water, it's all these things, right? And we do need to start with the problem. I was very fortunate to be in the first interdisciplinary project or really program at Stanford 45 years ago. And we started with the problem. I mean, our particular year was understanding the relationship between self and society. And we would read poetry, sociology, novels, history, psychology, political science. But the focus was on understanding the problem, not the discipline. If it helps you understand the problem, fine. If it doesn't, and graduate school, the way we train people in this country is all about understanding the discipline. I mean, political science, my PhD is in, fortunately, politics, not political science, the oxymoron of all morons, but it's a discipline that perhaps should just be eliminated. But it's all about teaching the methodology, and then if you happen to learn something about politics, that's fine. It's collateral damage. But instead of focusing on, here are the big problems, like you said, we got a big problem out there with food, water, climate change. Let's bring together all the factors and how can we train people to best understand how those factors fit together. Yes, we need experts, absolutely. But even the experts can be the greatest expert in the world on soil degradation, but then be given a broader education to see how that fits into everything else. And the policymakers need to know something about technology and science if they're going to grasp the nature of the climate change problem. In fact, we could hold some very basic science classes over on the Hill that probably be very appreciated, at least by the people holding them, because we have to keep the focus on the problems. And I was out at Singularity University just about 3 weeks ago, and somebody pointed out that a lot of people in Silicon Valley are focused on coming up with a new cool thing, and then they figure out how to sell it, what to do with it. And she said, we got to turn it around. What are the problems we face? And okay, let's mobilize people to find solutions. And those are going to be interdisciplinary solutions. They're going to be global solutions. So, how do we find, Joy's law, Bill Joy he wrote JavaScript, and he's kind of a guru in the Valley. But Joy's law is very simple. It was told to me by a professor at Stanford. Joy's law is most of the smartest people don't work for you. But most of the smartest people are not in the United States. We're 5% of global population, and, we probably have 5% of the world's smartest people or whatever. We got to go global. It's not just interdisciplinary, it's global. How do we work with the global community to focus on the big problems we all face? Because if we don't, we're probably literally and figuratively toast by the end of the century. So this is, you hit on a really, really big problem. I just want to add on the agriculture front. Part of what I didn't get into more is that vertical farms is a way of vastly reducing the footprint of agriculture, right? You're reducing you're eliminating fertilizers, you're producing food close to where it's consumed, you're using far less land by a long shot and much less water and energy to produce that food for people. A friend of mine, look up Modern Meadow, which is a company started by a friend, Andres Forgash, that's going to do 3D printed and cultured and printed meat. He was in Shanghai about 10 years ago and thinking, my God, we're going to have 9 billion people on the planet and they all want to eat meat. Livestock right now is 18% of global emissions. And it's 60 billion animals out there being, raised for slaughter, right? How are we going to do that when everybody goes up the food chain, right? That's what it's all about. So how about if we could print the meat? They can take live culture, cells from an animal, from a cow, and then turn it into meat. And it's a 98% reduction in land use and water use, 45% reduction in energy, and you produce it where it's consumed in the city. So that's one way of very systematically and very seriously tackling the whole energy, food, water, land nexus, climate change nexus of production of food. And it's a matter of working it through. There already are some vertical farms that are quite successful, and he's working it out on the 3D printing of food, and other meats, and others are too. So this is all possible, and that government's role can be in certainly helping finance this. Let's put the money into what the kind of solutions we need. Let's create the markets. The government can help create markets by this kind of finance, just deal with market failures and all. Anyway,
All right. Well, thank you. A huge thank you to the EPA, the World Environment Center, George Mason University for joining us on this Earth Day to think about promoting years of sustainability, responding to megatrends. We've recorded the event and we will post it on our newsecuritybeat.org blog and website. And a special thank you to Alan, Jennifer, Banning, and Terry for joining us today. Thank you. This was fantastic.
great. That's great.